NATO countries led by the US would attack Russia, or would certainly support Ukraine in pushing the Russians out of Ukraine. So, yeah, I think this is a very major step, and it would bring Ukraine in all but word into NATO. And again, presentationally, it's very important. The Americans are talking about it, the Europeans are talking about it, and Moscow will be hearing it. So that hopefully is a very, very strong driver to the Russians to go for the ceasefire and start negotiating seriously.
Hamish, the Bretton-Gordon is a retired British Army colonel, former commander of NATO's and UK's chemical, biological, radiological and nuclear reaction troops. Welcome to our program, Colonel Hamish.
Thank you very much for having me.
Russian dictator Vladimir Putin welcomed US offer on ending the war in Ukraine and said that this could become a basis for full peaceful settlement. Don't you think that Putin is being forced into this deal and is not able to sustain intensified pressure from the US administration?
Well, I think there are a number of things to look at here. First of all, the 28-point plan that the Americans, what was leaked to the media at the beginning of the weekend, seemed to be a plan that very much favoured the Russians rather than Ukraine. I think both Putin and others said that this is a start point. But when you look at some of the details of the original 28-point plan, it seemed to very much favour Russia rather than listening to a lot of the issues that Ukraine has, and seemed to forget, of course, that the Russians illegally invaded Ukraine back on the 24th of February 2022. And, Russia is the aggressor, and Ukraine and the Ukraine people are the ones who have suffered. So although everybody wants a just peace plan, I think on the face of it, the original plan that was presented, and there were many rumours that, where exactly that came from, was maybe a start, but not really having any substance. I mean, some of the elements like Ukraine would have to reduce the size of its military to 600,000, could never join NATO, would hand over the whole of the Donbass to the Russians. On the face of it, seemed pretty unacceptable to the Ukraine people and the Ukraine president. However, what we've seen subsequent to that, and I think the good thing is that has stimulated European leaders to get behind negotiating a peace deal. And over the weekend, yesterday, we then heard the European 24-point plan for peace in Ukraine. And that seems to be a far more realistic option, and getting more support from Ukraine and from Europe. And eventually, it seems that President Trump has also realized that the European plan is much closer to what could be acceptable as a just peace for Ukraine. There have been negotiations going on in Geneva. And we understand, latest news that the German and the Italian premiers are heading to Washington to further discuss it. So an awful lot has been going on at the moment. But the fact that we're all talking about a peace plan for Ukraine now, I think is very good. But absolutely, as British Prime Minister has said in the last few hours, it must be a just peace plan and something that has the Ukrainian people at its heart. And President Putin must not be rewarded for his aggression.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said Ukraine faces one of the most difficult moments in its history and impossible choice to make between losing an ally and losing dignity, or facing another stark winter with the possibility of blackouts and other serious problems with electricity. How do you read this message from President Zelensky, and how close we are to reaching any kind of a deal with Russian side?
Well, I think first of all, what President Zelensky said over the weekend, you can absolutely see it and things are moving so very, very rapidly at the moment. I think at the early part of the weekend, when President Zelensky spoke, it was really, the chance that it was being suggested by the US president that either Ukraine accepts this deal, the 28-point deal, or the US would walk away, really putting in President Zelensky in an impossible position. Either he accepted an unjust peace deal that really gave everything to Russia, all the things that they wanted. I mean, there are even rumors that actually it was the Russians who wrote this 28-point peace plan, and it was poorly translated from Russian into English. I mean, I cannot believe that is the case. But actually, when you read the detail of the original 28-point plan, you would think that absolutely everything Russia wants is in there, and nothing that Ukraine wants or deserves was in there at all. So I really felt for the President Zelensky over the weekend having to do that. Now, things have moved forward slightly because on the back of that, we then had the meeting in Geneva with European leaders and Secretary of State Rubio from the US, who seems to have now come up with a plan that is far closer to what President Zelensky and the Ukraine people may be able to accept. But initially over the weekend, everybody in Europe realizes that the US is the overriding economic and military power on the planet. And you would, of course, want them on your side all of the time, especially with the threats that are around at the moment. So, a really difficult weekend. But as we come into this week, things seem to be more positive. European leaders seem to have at least convinced the Americans that there is a just peace that can be had here. And again, we know that because President Trump and the Americans are so powerful that they have the possibility to force Putin to negotiate a just peace. So that, as I said earlier, things are moving really rapidly and changing at the moment. But it seems slightly brighter for Ukraine today than perhaps it was over the weekend.
Let's also cover and analyze this European plan. So first ceasefire and then any kind of discussions about territorial swaps. What is your take on that, and do you feel that Putin would agree to such a possibility? Because we have the most difficult part of this is Donbass. Russia would like Ukraine to surrender Donbass to the Russian side. This is non-starter for the Ukrainians. How do you read that, and how could this issue be solved? Would Putin can we force Putin to agree with ceasefire along the current front lines in Donbass region?
Yeah, I mean, we're really getting to the nitty-gritty of the detail here. The original plan that came out seems so far away from what Ukraine could agree to, and now we've got a plan that perhaps Ukraine could agree to, and Russians need to see how they face it. But until very recently, I think Putin was in a position where he thought actually that the American president was more on his side. Now, of course, we know that President Trump changes his mind very, very regularly, and has the ability to really make things happen, be they in Moscow or elsewhere around capital cities. The plan that's been put forward by Europe, seems to those of us on this side of the Atlantic to be perfectly reasonable. That Ukraine can maintain its military to a certain degree, that it won't have to give up land, particularly in the Donbass, which Russia is a long way from taking. I mean, the UK military intelligence update only a few weeks ago suggested that it would take Russia 4 years to take the whole of the Donbass and another 2 million casualties. So, on that sort of basis, why on earth, would Ukraine even contemplate giving it up as part of the Russian-American peace plan? So that is a possibility. Of course, the European plan also says that there's an opportunity for Ukraine to join the European Union and not turning down the possibility of joining NATO at some stage. It also, when it comes to security guarantees, allows for foreign, European, presumably troops in Ukraine to provide security against any further threats and attacks from Russia, which again, on the Russian plan, was a red line. So I think there is hopefully a lot of negotiation to be done here. But it seems that the plan presented by Europe is one that Europe and, more importantly, Ukraine might be able to accept. And Russia, I think, what we're slightly forgetting is that although Russia continues to attack and attack heavily the Ukraine power infrastructure in particular, and we've seen a lot of Ukrainian civilians killed recently, actually, we know that its economy, Russian economy, is in a perilous state at the moment, and the Russian military are still losing 1,000 soldiers a day, and are really, struggling. The only way they're making any headway, particularly in areas of the Donbass, are by sort of suicidal attacks, and they're not really making, a whole lot of ground. So I think when you put all that together, what we're seeing today, and if we are to believe Trump, only in the last few hours has said that there is a lot of positive moves going on the peace plan, the European peace plan. It seems that we might well get there. It will depend on how much pressure that Trump can put on Putin. And a lot of people are suggesting, actually, if US really put in all the sanctions it could on the Russians, then that could make a significant difference. And maybe that is what Trump eventually will do to Putin to make sure that he agrees. So I think we're in a time now for negotiation. The number one thing that we need is a ceasefire immediately, which is what the European plan says. But the Russians, quite apart from that, seem to be upping their attacks on Ukraine at the moment. But I think at the moment, and things change so rapidly in this, as we've seen over the last few days, I think people are feeling a little bit more positive than they were before the weekend started.
Do you feel that this also would be in Russia's interest to stop this killing and bleeding of the Russian army, because they have sustained probably more than 1.3 million casualties, dead and wounded? And don't you think that this could be the main reason why should Vladimir Putin accept this deal, and also maybe this could help him to stay in power?
Well, you would have thought so, absolutely. But Russia, it's an autocratic country. It's not a democratic country. Putin and those close to him seem to have very little concern for their soldiers or for the rank and file in Russia. The fact that they have, as you say, 1.3 million casualties, it seems incongruous to those of us in the West that the population would allow that to happen. But it is rather in the psyche of the Russians. Absolutely, you would have thought this is an opportunity for Putin to stop the killing and stop the thousands and thousands of casualties a week that the Russian military is suffering. But unfortunately, he's absolutely not like that. And Putin is ideologically driven. His idea for the greater Russia, unfortunately, hitherto, particularly President Trump, who is materialistically driven, has been negotiating on material issues rather than ideological issues, which is why we haven't really got very far. But it is an opportunity, and I'm sure I'm sure most people in Russia would want to see the killing stop, and certainly everybody in Europe, I'm sure Ukraine, wants to see the killing stop. So it seems that an immediate ceasefire is really the best hope all round, so that the detail and the negotiation can get going. But I suppose my final thing on this, again, Russian dictators, it is very different from Western European leadership here. Russian dictators, which is the way that Russia is generally run, if they fail, and I expect a lot of people around Putin feels that he would fail if he had a ceasefire on the current negotiation position, that would be the end of Putin. And there are certainly people like the Deputy Prime Minister and others in Russia who are waiting to take over from him. And I expect that is a very powerful thing in the back of his mind when he comes to these negotiations. So, yeah, everybody wants a peace now. Unfortunately, Putin is an autocratic tyrant running Russia and is not making decisions for the benefit of Russia and mankind as a whole. It's purely for the benefit himself at the moment, it would appear.
From your perspective, can Vladimir Putin agree with this better for Ukraine deal with ceasefire along the current front lines without losing power simply?
Well, I'm not sure if he can, and without being a sort of fly on the wall, as it were, in the Kremlin, who knows? And I expect that is the big issue. It's really how much influence President Trump is prepared to put onto Russia to make this happen. Now, one of the key issues that we haven't discussed yet, one of the European plan is that Russia would come back into the G8 group of countries, the leading industrial countries in the world. Now, if Putin could perhaps show that by getting back to the G8 and by doing deals with the United States that would get the Russian economy back booming again, then that might be a way out for him. Who knows? But it just, for an ideologue like Putin to do a deal on commercial grounds, just does not seem to be the way that his mind works at the moment. So I think we shall have to see, and quite frankly, if Putin survives or not in his position, I think to most of us here in Europe, we don't really care. What we really want is a ceasefire and a just peace for Ukraine, whatever that takes.
Also, recently, David Ignatius wrote an editorial for the Washington Post, also outlining the main threats for Vladimir Putin in case of any kind of ceasefire deal made over Ukraine, and he just wrote that many people in Russia could begin to ask questions. Was this worth fighting and dying for? I mean, this deal over the war in Ukraine and the outcome of this war for the Russian people. What is your take on that? Maybe this could be one of the biggest Putin's fear.
I think it's absolutely what Putin is thinking about, because he started off this war on the basis that he was going to redraw the old Soviet Union lines, territorial lines, and the first part of that was to subjugate Ukraine. His plan is not to stop at Ukraine. Ideally, he would take the Baltic states as well, and perhaps Romania and Bulgaria, which that is his avowed intent, and it would appear that a lot of people in Russia agreed with that. Now, the fact that he has got a tiny part of Ukraine and suffered so many casualties, and the economy has been absolutely devastated. This must be very heavy on his mind, and I agree, with the Washington Post entirely here. This is failure. If he doesn't do that, which is why there may be some stitch up that he can do with Trump on the financial side that will make it look a little bit better. But ultimately, Putin, who's been in power now for 25 years or so, wanted to go down as one of the great Russian leaders. But at the moment, that's going to be far from it. And what we understand about Putin's psyche is that's really all he worries about, which is pretty devastating for the Russian people and the millions who have been killed and injured because of his illegal war. He seems to be more concerned about his legacy than virtually anything else.
Also, just wanted to add that Russia was on the brink of civil war during this war. I mean, during this Prigozhin march on Moscow, and many Russian people could also begin asking questions whether this was worth it, the brink of collapse of Russia and the possibility of civil war inside Russia.
Well, that's, I mean, as you mentioned, Prigozhin, the Wagner leader, who did at one stage look to be marching on Moscow, but he and his supporters, got a pretty ignominious ending. And although their aeroplane crashed, I don't think there are many people who don't think that the Russian Secret Service were behind it. And the way that the Russians run things with their very extensive secret service, any dissent is very, very quickly dealt with. I mean, we just see the likes of Alexei Navalny, who was the opposition leader, who ultimately, it's pretty clear that was done away with in the Arctic when he was sent to jail there. So any dissent is hammered down. Now, whether in this day where it's very difficult to control all this media and social media going on, people in Russia are now probably much more aware of what's going on than in the past, that there might be the opportunity. But one just has to look at history. The Russian people do not seem to complain and protest as perhaps people in virtually every other country in the world do that's not a tyranny. So I think it's difficult for us in the West to really understand. I mean, it would never, activities by a tyrant like him would never be allowed in democratic countries in the West. But, that's just, very different to us. So who knows? But it would appear that people are beginning to question much more than they ever have done in the past. And that must be starting to affect, I would have thought, the Kremlin's thinking in some way or other.
Let's cover also another element of security guarantees. According to the Washington Post, some US officials were discussing the possibility of providing Ukraine with Tomahawk cruise missile as part of a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. How close we are to such pro-Ukrainian terms in the deal and such possibility, and would this be enough to deter Russia? Because it seems understandable for us that Russia would never ever agree with deployment of Western troops in Ukraine. Maybe at least Tomahawk cruise missiles would help Ukraine to defend itself.
Well, I think, we can talk about individual weaponry, which, I'm not sure if we could come up with a satisfactory answer here. But certainly, the European answer is to have European troops based in Ukraine. Now, that might not be acceptable. Well, probably won't be acceptable. The Russians have already said it won't be acceptable. But actually, the Russians know that the US has the military capability to enforce, a reasonable level of security to Ukraine, that one should imagine that the Russians rather wouldn't try and come up against. Now, part of that, no doubt, would be cruise missiles as well. But I think part of it would be an American guarantee to support Ukraine if Russia did attack again. So I think this is all part of the negotiations here. But the fact that the Americans are talking about it, because they're obviously thinking and planning for it, is a good thing. And that should have resonance in Russia as well when they come to negotiate this peace deal as it moves forward.
You just mentioned about security guarantee. European plan includes the Article 5-like security guarantee for Ukraine from the United States, and this we should also get US backing for this plan initiative. What could this mean? Like, attack against Ukraine would mean direct retaliation, military involvement of the US troops in this war, US Air Force, for example?
Well, absolutely. A lot of people are talking about this security guarantee being an Article 5 security guarantee, which in effect would make Ukraine part of NATO. It might not, it might not sign the paperwork and have NATO flags all over Ukraine, but that's what people are talking about. And of course, the inference of Article 5 is exactly that. If Ukraine was attacked by Russia, then NATO countries led by the US would attack Russia, or would certainly support Ukraine in pushing the Russians out of Ukraine. So, yeah, I think this is a very major step, and it would bring Ukraine in all but word into NATO. And again, presentationally, it's very important. The Americans are talking about it, the Europeans are talking about it, and Moscow will be hearing it. So that hopefully is a very, very strong driver to the Russians to go for the ceasefire and start negotiating seriously.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me, and glory to Ukraine.